Brooklyn, New York, 1882. Cobblestone streets rattled with horse-drawn carts, and the air smelled of coal smoke and sweat. Among the tenements, in a cramped apartment on the Lower East Side, Johnny Torrio was born to Italian immigrants who carried old-world pride and new-world ambition. From a young age, Johnny, known to family and friends by his shortened name, witnessed survival as a lesson. The streets were lawless, yet structured by invisible codes. Neighborhood gangs ruled with fists, threats, and respect. Johnny learned early. Fear could be harnessed, but discipline commanded power. By age 10, he was already running errands for older boys in his block's petty operations, collecting debts, delivering messages, observing the hierarchy of street life. Every whispered warning, every small victory, became a lesson in organization. Violence was constant, but survival required strategy. He saw the difference between chaos and controlled influence. In his teens, he worked small jobs, butcher shops, construction, occasional bookkeeping. But the pull of the streets was irresistible. Brooklyn's Italian neighborhoods were hotbeds of extortion, gambling dens, and protection rackets. Johnny gravitated naturally, fascinated less by the thrill of theft than by the precision of the system. By 1900, he was formally involved with local gangs, learning from men older, wiser, and bloodier than he was. He studied them, not to imitate their recklessness, but to understand it. Brute force could seize a block, a saloon, or a neighborhood, but it could not maintain it. Only foresight and structure created lasting power. Johnny memorized this lesson well. He began forming alliances with other ambitious young men. Neighborhood lines mattered, but opportunity mattered more. Brooklyn was crowded, violent, and unforgiving. To thrive, Torrio realized, he would need to understand every player, every route, every lawman, and every politician. Observation became his weapon. Torrio's first major break came in the world of small-scale gambling. Pool halls, card games, and lottery operations were everywhere. He was quick to spot inefficiencies, to streamline collections, and to ensure the right men were paid, and the wrong men watched carefully. Johnny was meticulous. Envelopes were counted, ledgers kept, debts tracked. Unlike many of his peers, he sought control through organization, not just intimidation. It was in these years that he developed a philosophy that would define his life: discretion, patience, and mentorship. He realized that every empire had a rise, a peak, and a fall, and those who survived understood the importance of timing. Violence was necessary, but timing and subtlety were more powerful than bullets. By 1905, Torrio had earned respect as a rising figure in Brooklyn's criminal underworld. Older mobsters began to notice his intelligence. He was not flashy. He did not seek notoriety. He did not carry a Tommy gun for show. Instead, he carried influence, an invisible force that began shaping the streets. He also understood alliances. Torrio forged early connections with Jewish and Italian gangsters, learning to bridge ethnic divides that often fueled conflict. Meyer Lansky's predecessors were still in the streets. Torrio saw the value of cooperation over endless turf wars. He watched, learned, and slowly built a network that could extend beyond Brooklyn. In 1908, at age 26, Johnny Torrio made a pivotal decision. The future of his ambitions lay not just in New York, but elsewhere. The Prohibition whispers were beginning. Chicago beckoned, a city ripe with opportunity, corruption, and potential for influence. Where Brooklyn was crowded and constrained, Chicago was a blank canvas, a place where a disciplined, intelligent organizer could build a true empire. Before leaving, he reflected on his years in Brooklyn, the lessons of patience, the necessity of alliances, and the power of invisible influence. He had survived street gangs, law enforcement, and rivals. He had learned that brutality alone was fleeting, but systems, networks, organizations, and mentorship were enduring. With a suitcase, a few trusted companions, and a mind honed by years in Brooklyn's streets, Johnny Torrio boarded a train to Chicago. He carried more than ambition, he carried a blueprint. The lessons of the Lower East Side, the victories and failures, the whispers of power and loyalty, all came with him. Chicago would not yet know his name, But when it did, it would change the course of organized crime in America forever. Torrio arrived not as a flamboyant gangster, but as a strategist, a teacher, a mentor, a man who understood that true power is silent, patient, and enduring. By the time he stepped onto the Chicago streets in 1909, Johnny Torrio was no longer a boy from Brooklyn. He was a master of observation, a silent king in training, and the man who would mentor one of the most infamous gangsters the world would ever see, Al Capone. Brooklyn in 1908 was a city of opportunity and danger, a melting pot of immigrants, ambition, and crime. Johnny Torrio arrived with little more than a plan, a network of contacts, and a mind trained to see patterns where others saw chaos. He stepped off the train into a world teeming with potential and peril. The city's Italian neighborhoods were alive with business, both legal and illegal. Saloon owners paid protection to local gangs. Gambling dens operated in the shadows, their profits immense and their operators ruthless. Torrio observed it all, not with fear, but with calculation. Every alley, every storefront, every crooked politician could be a tool or a threat. Torrio aligned himself with the Morello crime family, one of the oldest and most established Italian gangs in New York. Here, he learned the inner workings of a structured criminal organization: collections, enforcement, and the art of subtle intimidation. Unlike many of his peers, Torrio did not rely on flash or violence to command respect. He used patience, loyalty, and strategy to build influence. He also understood the importance of bridging divides. Brooklyn was a mosaic of ethnic enclaves. Italians, Jews, and Irish all jostled for power. Torrio recognized opportunity in collaboration. By forming alliances with emerging Jewish and Italian mobsters, he created networks that could extend beyond local turf wars. He learned early that cooperation could generate far more wealth than conflict. In the Morello family, Torrio began managing gambling operations, overseeing poker games, lotteries, and small-scale rackets. His genius lay in organization. Collections were precise, payouts were calculated, and risks minimized. Each operation was a microcosm of his philosophy: control through structure, not brute force. Conflict was inevitable. Rival gangs, jealous of Torrio's rapid rise, sought to challenge him. But he handled disputes differently. A threat was met not always with a bullet, but with negotiation, persuasion, or strategic intimidation. Torrio's reputation grew. He was dangerous, yes, but he was also clever, disciplined, and nearly impossible to predict. It was during this period that Torrio crossed paths with several men who would later become influential figures in American organized crime. He observed the ambitions of young hustlers, noting who had vision and who was merely violent. Among them, Al Capone's name was still unknown, but Torrio would eventually recognize the same qualities in the boy that had made him rise above the chaos of Brooklyn's streets. By 1910, Torrio was more than an operative. He was a strategist. He understood law enforcement and politics, recognizing that influence in these areas could protect and expand his operations. Bribery, intimidation, and alliances with corrupt officials became routine, not just to evade justice but to secure growth. Torrio's influence extended beyond mere street-level operations. He began advising and mentoring younger gangsters, teaching them how to expand networks, manage money, and avoid unnecessary attention. He emphasized discretion over spectacle. Violence was a tool, not a show. Ambition, he taught, must be tempered with patience. In 1915, Torrio's reputation had grown to the point where even rival families acknowledged his intelligence and strategic mind. While others relied on intimidation and headline-grabbing attacks, Torrio moved quietly, organizing operations that generated income and minimized exposure. His network now stretched across Brooklyn, Queens, and parts of Manhattan. The coming years would test him. World War I reshaped the economy, and law enforcement began to increase scrutiny of organized crime. Torrio adapted, learning to maneuver through new challenges, refining his methods, and solidifying his philosophy. The strongest empire is one that survives scrutiny, grows steadily, and strikes only when necessary. By 1919, Torrio had outgrown the streets of New York. He had built wealth, alliances, and a reputation as a master organizer. Now, the Windy City awaited, a place where he would implement every lesson learned, mentor a young Al Capone, and build a criminal empire that would endure for decades. Brooklyn had been his proving ground. Chicago would be his legacy. The city pulsed with opportunity. The railroads hummed. The lakefront shimmered in the summer sun. Factories belched smoke. And behind the bright streets and bustling ports, corruption thrived. Politics, law enforcement, and business all moved under invisible hands, and Johnny Torrio had arrived to take his place among them. Fresh from Brooklyn, Torrio brought more than ambition. He carried experience, strategy, and a philosophy refined over a decade in New York's underworld. Violence was not his first answer. Organization, discretion, and influence were. Chicago, with its booming population and brewing tension over Prohibition, offered a blank canvas for a man like him. His first major contact was Jim Colosimo, the powerful saloon owner whose empire dominated Chicago's vice economy. Colosimo was wealthy, respected, and cautious. Torrio quickly understood that taking over the city would require alliances, not confrontation. He approached Colosimo, offering his expertise in exchange for a foothold in Chicago's thriving underworld. Torrio's timing was impeccable. Prohibition had just begun, and the demand for illegal liquor skyrocketed. Colosimo's hesitation to enter bootlegging created a gap. Torrio saw the opportunity. The future of organized crime in Chicago would not be in gambling or brothels alone, but in the controlled, highly profitable distribution of alcohol. It was in these early years that Torrio encountered a young, brash figure named Al Capone. Capone, only 20 years old, had already made a name for himself as a street enforcer in Brooklyn and later in Chicago. Torrio recognized the boy's potential immediately. Intelligence tempered with ruthlessness, charisma, and loyalty. But he also saw the danger of impulsiveness. Torrio knew that for Capone to rise, he would need guidance. Mentorship would channel Capone's energy from reckless violence into calculated strategy. Torrio began mentoring Capone, teaching him the subtle arts of organization, negotiation, and leadership. He introduced him to key figures, instructed him on managing operations, and impressed upon him a crucial lesson. Power that is visible invites attack. Power that is invisible endures. Capone absorbed these lessons, though often impatiently, learning to balance his instincts with Torrio's strategic vision. Meanwhile, Torrio expanded his influence. He acquired speakeasies, controlled illegal breweries, and established networks of bootleggers that stretched from the city's docks to the suburbs. He moved methodically, ensuring every operation was protected, profitable, and discreet. Violence was used sparingly, only when absolutely necessary to enforce contracts or eliminate threats. Unlike Capone, he avoided spectacle, understanding that attention could be deadly. Torrio's empire grew quietly but relentlessly. He allied with other mobsters, both Italian and non-Italian, fostering partnerships that would stabilize his operations. He courted politicians, police officers, and business owners, ensuring that the machinery of the city worked in his favor. Corruption, Torrio realized, was as powerful as guns, and far less risky. By 1923, Chicago's underworld was being reshaped. Torrio's influence extended from Cicero to downtown, from warehouses to speakeasies. Rival gangs existed, but they were either neutralized, absorbed, or intimidated into compliance. Torrio's philosophy was clear. A well-organized, invisible empire outlasts a flashy, violent one. Capone, under Torrio's guidance, began to rise in prominence. He learned the art of intimidation balanced with strategy, the value of alliances, and the necessity of discretion. Torrio's mentorship transformed Capone from a reckless street fighter into a capable enforcer and future leader. The lessons of Brooklyn were being applied in Chicago, with even greater stakes. In 1924, Torrio faced his first major challenge. Rival factions attempted to encroach on his operations, testing his authority and resolve. Rather than engage in public conflict, he orchestrated negotiations, payoffs, and strategic maneuvers that neutralized the threat without unnecessary violence. The city's criminal landscape bowed, often unknowingly, to his strategy. Torrio also understood the importance of reputation. While Capone's boldness would later attract headlines, Torrio kept a low profile. Meetings were private, decisions calculated, and enforcement subtle. He understood that the true measure of power was not in being feared by the masses, but in being respected, and occasionally feared, by those who mattered. By 1925, Torrio had firmly established Chicago as his domain. Colosimo's hesitation had been overcome. Capone had matured under mentorship, and the networks of bootlegging, gambling, and political influence were fully operational. Torrio's empire was a blend of innovation, patience, and strategic foresight. Chicago had met Johnny Torrio, and under his guidance, the city would never be the same. Through mentorship, strategy, and a vision of invisible power, Torrio had built not just an empire, but a blueprint, a legacy that would define organized crime in America for decades to come. Chicago, 1920. Prohibition had transformed the city overnight. Speakeasies sprang up like mushrooms after rain. The clink of glasses, the hum of conversation, and the furtive exchange of cash and liquor filled the air. Amid it all, Johnny Torrio moved like a shadow, orchestrating a rising empire with a precision few could see, and fewer understood. It was during these years that Torrio began mentoring Al Capone, a young man brimming with raw energy, ambition, and a dangerous charm. Capone had survived the streets of Brooklyn, had worked under smaller gangs, and had a reputation for boldness. But Torrio recognized the difference between impulsive aggression and calculated strategy. Capone had fire. Torrio had the knowledge to channel it. From the beginning, Torrio emphasized organization over bravado. Force gets attention, he would explain, but structure keeps power. He showed Capone how to manage men, track collections, and negotiate with rivals. Every operation, from speakeasies to gambling dens, became a lesson in logistics and subtle influence. Capone watched, absorbed, and began to learn the art of invisibility, the strength of running a network without drawing the spotlight. Torrio introduced him to the mechanics of Chicago's underworld. Bribing officials, courting politicians, managing unions, and navigating law enforcement became part of Capone's education. Torrio understood that true power extended beyond street corners and saloons. It resided in the invisible levers of the city: contracts, permits, and favors owed in back offices and city halls. Mentorship also included people management. Torrio taught Capone to inspire loyalty, enforce respect, and understand the motivations of allies and adversaries alike. Violence was a tool, but not the only one. Influence, subtlety, and foresight could achieve far more than a bullet could. Capone learned to balance intimidation with diplomacy, understanding when silence, patience, and timing mattered more than spectacle. Together, they expanded operations across Chicago. Torrio handled the strategic decisions, while Capone executed with energy and presence. Speakeasies, breweries, and distribution networks flourished. Torrio ensured everything ran efficiently, collections were precise, disputes were mediated, and potential threats were identified before they could escalate. Capone saw firsthand how an empire could grow silently, without unnecessary chaos. Torrio also emphasized the importance of mentorship beyond himself. He encouraged Capone to guide younger men, teaching them the lessons he had learned in Brooklyn and New York: patience, organization, and discretion. The philosophy was clear: an empire survives when knowledge and strategy are passed down. Leadership was not about fear alone, but about preparation, planning, and continuity. During this period, Torrio cultivated alliances with other Italian and non-Italian gangs. Capone observed how Torrio built bridges between factions, understanding that collaboration could generate far more profit and security than constant conflict. Torrio demonstrated that the strongest networks are those that anticipate rivals' moves and preempt them through negotiation and influence. Torrio's approach to risk management fascinated Capone. Every operation had contingency plans. Every alliance was measured. Every rival's next move was considered. Capone began to understand that a leader's job was not to react to chaos, but to shape it, to anticipate it, and to bend it toward his advantage. Through mentorship, Torrio instilled discipline in Capone, teaching him that power could be permanent only when it was invisible, sustainable, and controlled. Bravado and violence, though tempting, were transient. Strategy, discretion, and the quiet management of systems, these endured. The bond between Torrio and Capone deepened. They were not simply mentor and student. They were partners in an evolving empire. Torrio trusted Capone to handle critical operations while still providing guidance, perspective, and oversight. Capone absorbed lessons in both management and psychology, understanding that a successful leader must be feared, respected, and shrewdly invisible all at once. By 1925, Torrio's mentorship had transformed Capone. The young man had evolved from a street fighter into a disciplined enforcer and emerging strategist. He was learning to command loyalty, anticipate threats, and expand influence, lessons that would define his career in the coming years. Torrio's guidance ensured that the foundation of the Chicago Empire was built not just on force, but on systems, networks, and intelligence. Torrio's genius lay in the unseen. Capone's rise, while impressive in its boldness, relied heavily on the foundation Torrio had constructed: efficient operations, careful alliances, and strategic oversight. The young gangster was learning that real power is measured not by headlines or gunfights, but by control, sustainability, and foresight. These years were formative. Chicago's underworld was evolving rapidly, and the pair worked tirelessly to shape it in their image. Torrio's lessons, discipline, organization, subtlety, became the blueprint for Capone's eventual leadership. And as the city thrived on the illicit economy of prohibition, the student and mentor forged a partnership that would leave an indelible mark on the history of organized crime. Chicago, once a chaotic mix of gangs and corruption, was slowly becoming a well-oiled machine under Torrio's guidance. Capone was learning to see the city as Torrio did, not just as a battlefield, but as a chessboard. Every player, every operation, every alliance was a piece to be moved with precision. And in those quiet, formative years, Capone learned the most important lesson of all: power that is invisible, patient, and strategic lasts far longer than any display of violence ever could. January 1925. Chicago's winter winds cut through the streets like knives. Snow fell softly on the cobblestones of 55th and State, muffling the city's noise, but tension hummed beneath the silence. Johnny Torrio, the man who built Chicago's criminal empire with brains instead of bullets, stepped out of his car that cold afternoon, unaware his reign was about to end. Moments later, gunfire shattered the calm. Torrio's rivals had finally come for him. A hail of bullets ripped through the air, slamming into his car, shattering glass, and striking Torrio multiple times. Somehow, he survived. Barely. Lying in a hospital bed, his body wrapped in bandages, Torrio had time to think. He'd built an empire, a fortune, a machine that turned prohibition into power. But he also knew it could all vanish in a flash of gunfire. That brush with death changed him. While the newspapers sensationalized the story, gang chief gunned down in Chicago ambush, Torrio quietly decided it was time. Time to step back. Time to hand over the empire to the one man he believed could control it: Alphonse Capone. Capone was only in his mid-20s, but he had learned from the best. Torrio had mentored him in everything: how to negotiate, how to bribe city officials, and most importantly, how to keep violence strategic, not chaotic. When Torrio recovered, he called Capone to his bedside. He didn't lecture. He didn't warn. He simply said, "It's yours now." And just like that, the torch passed. Torrio moved his family out of Chicago soon after. He bought a quiet home in Brooklyn, far from the roar of machine guns and the flashing lights of the press. Officially, he was retired. Unofficially, he was still a quiet architect behind the scenes. He'd left a blueprint behind, one Capone followed to the letter. Chicago under Capone became something else entirely. Where Torrio had ruled with quiet precision, Capone ruled with swagger. He turned Chicago's underworld into a spectacle, buying politicians, running fleets of trucks loaded with Canadian whiskey, and throwing lavish parties that mocked prohibition itself. But the violence Torrio had worked so hard to contain began to spiral. By 1926, Chicago was a city divided between competing bootlegging factions. Bombings, drive-bys, and gang hits became part of the city's rhythm. Capone still followed Torrio's lessons. He always struck strategically, never randomly. But his world was louder, bloodier, and bigger than anything Torrio had imagined. Still, behind every headline, Torrio's fingerprints were visible. The network of alliances, the structure of bribery, the use of legitimate businesses as fronts, all Torrio's design. Capone was the face of organized crime. Torrio was its mind. By 1929, Chicago's underworld was boiling over. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre became the defining symbol of the era. 7 men gunned down in broad daylight, their bodies lined up against a garage wall. Capone's enemies were being erased one by one. To the public, it looked like unchecked brutality. To those who understood, it was Torrio's system still functioning, ruthless, efficient, and profitable. Torrio, now in his mid-40s, watched from a distance. He had no need for headlines or territory anymore. His investments stretched beyond Chicago, into real estate, stocks, and quiet partnerships that kept his fortune safe, even as Capone's empire began to crumble under federal investigation. He'd built something that outlasted him, an organization designed not around one man but around a structure, and that was his genius. Torrio had always believed the future of crime wasn't in shootouts or street corners. It was in cooperation and structure. He envisioned a national syndicate where crime families from New York to Chicago to Los Angeles could coexist and coordinate. No wars, no wasted blood, just business. That idea, born from Torrio's near-death experience in 1925, would one day evolve into the Commission, the governing council of organized crime that dominated America for decades. While Capone battled law enforcement and the press in the late 1920s, Torrio was already laying the groundwork for the next phase. He met quietly with figures like Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, sharing his vision of a disciplined, corporate-style underworld. Luciano would later say that Torrio was the smartest of us all. By 1930, Chicago's skyline glittered with new skyscrapers, monuments to capitalism and ambition. But beneath that skyline lay the invisible structure Torrio had built years before. Capone ruled its streets. Politicians still took envelopes. The police still looked the other way. But Torrio? He was gone, watching from afar. He'd outlasted the bullets, the raids, the chaos. While others rose and fell in gunfire and headlines, Torrio had quietly succeeded where few mobsters ever did. He got away with it. He had proven that power didn't always require violence. Sometimes, the smartest move was to step back and let the empire run itself. The kingmaker had retired, but his kingdom endured. Capone's Chicago was a mirror of Torrio's lessons: ambition without limits, order through intimidation, and profit above all. Yet as federal agents began to close in on Capone, it was clear. Torrio's design had worked too well. He'd built something that even the law couldn't fully dismantle. Johnny Torrio, the quiet visionary who turned organized crime into organized business, had done what few in his world ever could. He'd left the stage alive. And the system he built would shape the American underworld for generations. By the dawn of the 1930s, the roaring chaos of Chicago had quieted, for Johnny Torrio at least. The snow, the gunfire, the frantic years of Prohibition were behind him. Al Capone now wore the crown, and Torrio had vanished into the mist, quietly, deliberately, like a magician who knew when to leave the stage. He resurfaced not in Chicago, but in New York, the city that never slept, where the next generation of mobsters was already building something far greater than bootlegging. Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, they were young, ambitious, and eager to turn Torrio's blueprint into a national system. And Torrio, the architect of organized crime, became their teacher. He didn't command troops anymore. He didn't run rackets. He didn't need to. He advised. Quietly. Carefully. Meetings took place in restaurants, hotels, or cigar lounges. Torrio never raised his voice, never made threats. He spoke in calm, measured tones about restraint, patience, and the art of staying invisible. Violence draws heat, he once told Luciano. Business keeps you alive. These weren't the words of a gangster. They were the words of a strategist. Torrio had seen what happened when crime became personal, emotional, loud. He'd watched Capone fall under the weight of fame, undone not by bullets but by taxes, by attention, by arrogance. Torrio knew better. Invisibility was survival. When Prohibition ended in 1933, many mobsters panicked. The river of illegal profits from bootlegging suddenly ran dry, but Torrio saw opportunity where others saw disaster. He helped advise on diversification, gambling, labor racketeering, loan sharking, even legitimate businesses. The mob didn't die with Prohibition. It evolved, and Torrio's lessons guided that transformation. His protege built what he had always envisioned, a syndicate that functioned like a corporation, with territories, rules, and a board of directors. Disputes were settled in meetings, not massacres. The days of Tommy guns in the streets gave way to handshakes in hotel suites. In 1931, when Luciano organized the Commission, the governing council of American organized crime, Torrio's influence was everywhere. He wasn't on the roster, but his philosophy shaped every decision. The concept of balance between families, mutual respect, and shared profit. It was pure Torrio. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, Torrio maintained a low profile. He moved quietly from New York to New Jersey, keeping to small suburban homes far from the spotlight. While the FBI chased headlines and flashy names, Torrio was invisible. No indictments, no raids, no scandals. He had mastered the art of existing between worlds, too legitimate for prosecution, too connected for irrelevance. Occasionally, the press caught wind of his name, often as a footnote in the story of Capone or Luciano. But those who really knew understood. Torrio was still the quiet power behind the system. His phone calls carried weight. His advice shaped decisions that rippled through the underworld. And yet, he never flaunted it. The younger mobsters revered him, not as a boss, but as something rarer, a thinker. By the mid-1940s, Torrio had become a relic of another age, but one whose influence was now woven into the DNA of organized crime itself. The syndicate he'd inspired stretched across the nation, from Chicago to New York, from Las Vegas to Havana. Torrio's vision of coordination over chaos had come true. The mob wasn't a street gang anymore. It was an institution. And yet Torrio himself lived modestly. No mansions, no limousines, no newspapers calling him public enemy. He lived in quiet homes, wore tailored suits, read the papers, and smiled at the headlines that celebrated or condemned the empire he'd once designed. He had what few gangsters ever achieved: peace. In his final years, Torrio's health began to fade. He was in his mid-70s, still sharp, still respected, still quietly meeting old friends in cafes and corner restaurants. He often spoke not of money or power, but of time, how quickly it had passed, how violently it had moved. On April 16, 1957, Johnny Torrio collapsed while sitting in a barber's chair in Brooklyn. A heart attack, swift, final, and almost poetic. There were no bodyguards, no headlines, no gunfire, just a quiet end to a man who had lived in shadows and outlasted them all. He died the same way he had lived in his later years, quietly, efficiently, and out of sight. But his ideas never died. The syndicate he'd dreamed of endured for decades. The mob families he helped shape became institutions, woven into the economic and political fabric of America. Even as the FBI launched its great crusades in the 1950s and 60s, even as crime lords were dragged before Senate hearings and their empires crumbled, Torrio's principles remained visible in their structure: organized, patient, resilient. Every rule, every hierarchy, every unwritten code of discretion could be traced back to him. His legacy wasn't bloodshed. It wasn't chaos. It was order. The kind of order that let crime blend seamlessly into the machinery of the modern world. In the end, Johnny Torrio proved something profound. The most powerful gangster is the one who doesn't need to be seen. He had begun as a street hustler in Brooklyn, risen to power in the underworld of Chicago, and transformed organized crime into a disciplined, almost corporate system. While others chased fame, Torrio pursued permanence, and he found it. When historians look back on the violent legends of Capone, Luciano, and Lansky, one truth remains clear: none of them would have existed without Torrio. He was the quiet engineer behind the empire, the man who taught the underworld how to think. Johnny Torrio's empire didn't die with him in 1957. It lived on, in boardrooms and backrooms, in handshakes and alliances, in every criminal organization that learned his ultimate lesson. Power isn't about being feared. It's about never needing to be seen.